From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And coming up, K-State's Dan O'Brien looking ahead to the USDA's pivotal crop production report to be released a week from today. That's part of his weekly segment on the grain market trends. Then K-State's Lucas Haig will talk about the factors that should determine when that final irrigation is applied to row crops for the season. He cites years of K-State field observations that have resulted in a calendar range by crop for that last irrigation to go on to achieve the best water use efficiency while maintaining crop productivity. And later on, K-State's Mary Knapp will be Mike's side with the latest on Kansas agricultural weather. Plus more directly ahead on Agriculture Today.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. Welcome to you once more. And standing by in studio now to visit with us about the grain markets is K-State Research and Extension grain market economist Dan O'Brien, where we'll focus largely on the corn and grain sorghum markets this time around, Dan. The next keystone of market reaction may well be that USDA report coming up a week from today, September the 11th, as the department's out gathering information from the fields now that will be plugged into that report.
It's an important report. The August crop production report did not include any in-the-field samples, any enumerated samples by the USDA. And it's just as well, really, in this sense, in that was early enough in development and prior to the windstorm and some of the drought effects that have happened of late that although the USDA did look at satellite images, no doubt, and also surveyed farmers, still this will be the first time out in the field. So this September report, the October, November, they'll all be pretty important. Of course, again, as we already mentioned, one of the big issues will be the compounding effect of not only dry conditions that occurred in Iowa, but the windstorm that came through there and affected them in particular, maybe and bled over some into Illinois. Whereas the USDA had projected in that August report a record high U.S. corn yield of 181.8 bushels per acre and a crop size of 15.3 billion bushels. And we're seeing a lot more in the field observations that will be somewhat lower than that. Is it 180, 178, thereabouts? I think if there's a new consensus in the market to respond to, if we get higher or lower than that, it's probably that we're looking at something along the lines of maybe 14.8 billion bushels. If things are really rougher than that, 14.5, it would be a real surprise and shock to the market to come in lower than 14.5 in particular. So again, 14.8 billion bushels, and that would be down about 500 million from that, again, August number. And if nothing else changed on the supply-demand balance sheet for corn, then we'd still be at, say, 2.1, 2.2 billion bushels of corn. Carry out still above 2, and prices somewhat higher, but not appreciably. So I guess my own thinking that probably like a combination of 500 million or more lower production and strength in demand, particularly now we're seeing exports coming in pretty strong from China. I think a combination of those two to really see us move below 2 billion bushels and start to see prices closer to 360, 370, 380 per bushel. When the USDA came out and put a 310 per bushel U.S. average price in that August report, it just seems low relative to where the stocks reports figures were at 18, 19%. As their projection and where prices have been in the past.
You're more bullish than that, really.
Well, I would hope I'm more reasonable than that. So I don't know if I call it 360, 50 or 360 bullish,
right.
But that's awfully pessimistic relative to stocks to use of 18%. I think the number they were looking at was 2.7, 2.8 billion bushels. So at least my expectation, and I think it's not that uncommon, is that we'll see that number lower. And really what you're looking at now, it would be how the demand holds up. And again, if anything, we're looking at, whereas we finished at about 1.8 billion bushels of exports last year, now in the August number, we were at 2.225 billion. And, we're having daily, every other day, pretty strong movement into that market from China, from elsewhere, but particularly China. So that's a big issue. China has their production problems, and what you read of what they are dealing with over there would lead you to think that, I wouldn't say they're panicky, but they are sure not unaggressive in terms of buying corn from wherever. So we shall see. It's either us, United States, or Brazil. Now, Ukraine has emerged as kind of a third supplier along with Argentina. Argentina has its political issues. Ukraine's had some dry conditions that have cut back their corn crop. So, a person has to be careful, not just be a cheerleader on a market, but there are some factors that are not entirely bearish affecting the corn market that I think we'll have to deal with. And, China, as they come through this fall, they have shown no hesitancy to come buying. And frankly, when you look at corn futures, Dees corn yesterday closing about $3.54, thereabouts. That's not $4. That's not a bad situation. I do think at the local level here in Kansas, just depending where you're at, we don't have weak corn basis. We have pretty decent corn basis levels, particularly out in the West where we have some dryness of our own. So maybe that's how this demand is expressing itself. And futures are so-so as the market looks at the broader aggregate U.S. production issue and is kind of discounting any major crop problems still. Maybe that'll change after September, October, November reports. But there's enough demand pull going on that from the different usage sectors that, gee whiz, we're seeing basis not being completely terrible.
And if we turn our attention to grain sorghum, there is just no question that complex is benefiting handsomely from export demand.
Well, that's right. When you look at forward sales of sorghum, as we're now starting this 2020-2021 marketing year, again, that started September 1st, we're at about 27-28%, if not higher, of the sales that are USDA projected to have in this coming marketing year, 260 million. We've already have purchases on the books for about 28% of that or more. And for corn, that's also pretty good. We're about 24% or more in terms of what that higher projection, 2.225 billion bushels is. So lower U.S. dollar demand from China in particular and tightening up of other places around the world are on the positive side. To me, we're in kind of a conundrum. We see pretty decent crop production prospects, kind of discounting what could happen in Iowa and other places so far in terms of either of corn and grain sorghum, but yet got some positive prospects on the usage side, particularly in exports. So that's good. And I've been looking also at the ethanol numbers for feed grains, corn in particular. Well, right now, given what's happening in grain sorghum basis, I don't think there's much grain sorghum going into ethanol. Mm-hmm. I think that's pretty much all corn. And we've recovered from pre-COVID-19 levels to about the tune of about 85% or so of what we had before. So it hasn't fallen off the map. And to the degree that the U.S. economy would continue to do well, then that's pulling in gasoline demand and all the help for corn that you would want. Well, we'll see the livestock feeding numbers, how they work out too. But I guess overall, even though prices really for corn futures kind of ranging around $350, $360, depending on the day for new crop corn, that's not a gangbusters high number, but it's not $3 or $3.25, and these factors have to be dealt with that could come in and that could tighten things up a fair amount. I think the big factor right now for corn is, USDA came out with 2.8 billion bushels in that August number, and until that number gets addressed or changed, I don't know that the market's going to be terribly anxious to do a lot proactive price-wise.
And we have to give a nod, Dan, to the soybean trade. It continues its upward track this week. It's slowed here and there at times, but no doubt, as it's now well over $9, it's going in the right direction.
Well, no doubt. Yesterday, the November closed at 9.66, was actually up a few cents. September, 9.68 3/4, up about 6. So there's some positives there. The export numbers were strong. Yesterday they were strong for corn also yesterday. So again, you wonder now as we set towards the end of the crop availability for what Brazil has to put on the market, and the world comes looking to us for supplies for a while here, where that market will go. So again, 9.66 as a close yesterday is not $10, but it's not 8.5 either. So it's looking like a positive situation. So I talk positively about these markets, but yet harvest isn't that far away. There'll come a time when we have trucks lined up outside elevators, and things will probably weaken at least temporarily. But for these buyers, any weakness is just it's a merchandising buying opportunity for them from overseas. Add in our weaker U.S. dollar, and even though prices are a little bit better, this is really a buyer's time to shine before we get towards the end of our year, before Brazil comes in, and we could see a squeeze on prices that would push us just that much higher.
And if you just think of it historically, in September, we usually don't see this robust of a price positioning, if you will. But what we have today is encouraging for the long pull.
I just think this situation with China, with their flooding and all the damage to their infrastructure, and I think if you compare to what we had last year in the Missouri River and all that, that was catastrophic for the areas affected, and it kind of messed up our logistics system. And what we hear from there is that it's at least as bad, if not much more widespread over there in terms of their damage, and it's affected their grain logistics, and it's affected the world grain market.
Always good to have you in town, Dan, to visit. Many thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
And he's along every Friday for his insights on the grain market trends. Dan O'Brien is a grain market economist with K-State Research and Extension. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and we'll be back with more for you after this break over the K-State Radio Network.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State Research and Extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today continues now, and as we're into that transition from summer to fall, we'll take on a pertinent topic for you row crop irrigators. And that is the thought process that should go into timing that final irrigation of the growing season. Our guest will remind us that there are worthwhile reasons for doing so. Lucas Haig is along via phone. Lucas, as you know, is the crop production specialist for K-State Research and Extension in Northwest Kansas. And Lucas is among those from K-State who have researched this topic in years past. And being particular about when one shuts the wells off for the growing season, Lucas, why this matters? Why is the timing of that last irrigation of significance to the producer?
Well, Eric, it's one of those deals that, over the years, that, for a very long time, there's just kind of the old rule of thumb of saying, well, we're going to irrigate through, some guys, it was Labor Day, for example. But the thing is, we know year-to-year variability can be quite huge in terms of both the progression of the crop and its water demand. For example, this year, the last couple of weeks, we've seen some quite high ET rates for this time of year due to the heat and conditions we've had, and we've been pretty much under normal on precipitation. So you got those year-to-year variabilities in weather, and as well the fact of, we've got a lot of producers that are planting a range of hybrid maturities over a range of planting dates, and so obviously not everything is going to be finishing up at the same time. And so we looked here in the E-Update article, we looked at some work that Freddie Lamb, our irrigation engineer, had done here over the years, and showing that optimal date to terminate irrigation can vary tremendously here in northwest Kansas, and really that's applicable to all of our irrigated growing areas.
We want to talk of those indicators that have been uncovered through research here, but the consequences of early termination of irrigation versus late termination as far as the impact on the crop, those can be dramatic, you say.
Yes, I mean, really, we're walking a pretty fine line on the sword here, and if we think about the penalty of terminating too early, that's leaving yield on the table, and so obviously that's a pretty significant negative economic impact, and that's not what we want to do. We've got so much invested into this crop already, and including a bunch of irrigation water. Shorting it now is going to hurt the efficiency of all those inputs that we've put on and reduce our yields. The flip side of that is if we over-irrigate, that can lead to a lot of issues as well. If we end up with too much water in the profile, we don't have any room to store any overwinter precipitation, and actually we'll get drainage of that profile over the winter, and so we'll completely lose some of that water out of the rooting zone. Another thing that I'm not sure is talked about often enough, but if we think about the compactability of soil, over-irrigating at the end of the season can lead to soil moisture contents that are much more prone to compaction. Mm-hmm. And so we want to make sure we're not setting ourselves up for a bad situation there where now the compaction damage being done by our combines and our grain carts in the field isn't made worse by the fact we over-irrigated.
So then what should determine that irrigation termination date? Again, based on research that you, Freddie Lamb, and others have conducted in western Kansas, what should a producer center on there?
Well, the key thing is just being in touch with where your crop is at developmentally, and then that give you a pretty rough idea in terms of both how many days to maturity and in a typical year how much water that would require. And so we kind of balance, okay, how much you think about it, kind of looking at a fuel gauge on your vehicle, how much I know I'm going to need this much to get to my destination. You look at the tank. In other words, a lot of our producers have soil moisture sensors out, or we go out and probe and we say, okay, what's it going to take to get me there? How much do I got left in the tank? And then how much irrigation do I need to put on to make up the difference? And so, for example, corn that's just beginning dent, we're needing about 5 inches to finish. Once we're at full dent, we're only needing about 2.5 inches to finish. If you remember, a lot of our silt loam soils in the state will hold about 2 inches per foot. And so, if I'm coming into full dent and I've got a good 2 foot of moisture in the profile, that's a pretty good sign I've got enough to finish me out.
Mm-hmm. And if you look at grain sorghum and soybeans, a similar calculation, if you will. The numbers will differ, of course, though.
Yeah, it really behaves quite similarly, sorghum to corn especially. So soft dough, we're needing about 5 inches to finish, and by the time we're hard dough, we're only needing about 2 inches to finish. Beans are a little bit of a tougher one, but in general, even though once we're at full seed fill, still about 3.5 inches to finish up there.
Right. Now, drawing from the research that's been conducted over quite a few years' time, you've come up with some calendar dates where the maximum yields can be matched up with certain termination dates to give a producer an idea of that calendar range that they might want to look at, correct?
Yeah, and I think most people would be shocked. So looking at, Freddie had a study here at Colby going back to 1993, and over that range of time, the optimal date for terminating irrigation for maximum yield ranged anywhere from the 12th of August to the 21st of September. And so, we're talking well over a month. We're talking close to 6 weeks range in terms of that optimal termination. And so if you think about that and say, okay, well, if I'm just going to use the rule of thumb of shutting off on Labor Day, those years when we could have terminated in mid-August, we're talking about, easily several inches of over-application. And the years where, the optimal date, we got quite a few years where the optimal date was as late as, well into the teens or even 20th of September. And so shutting off early there obviously would have left yield on the table. And so it's a huge range, and so it just really illustrates the value in using soil moisture sensor technology or ET scheduling, as well as knowing the actual growth stage of the crop in the field.
And there is another standard that is cited in the article that we're referencing that you would bring up as well, that if you're looking at something to build upon here as far as a benchmark, maintaining that soil water content at around the 55% mark is important.
Yeah, that's really where we'd like to finish out at, to make sure that we didn't short that crop at all. Is about that 55%, because at that point we know that we haven't shorted the crop, and on the other side of that, we know we don't have a lot of excess water that we're going to lose to drainage over the winter time.
So, Lucas, as you look around, do producers still have some latitude on this last irrigation date, do you think?
Yeah, I think so, Eric. The last 2 weeks have been especially hard on our crops out here. We've had a lot of heat and a lot of wind. We've seen, as I mentioned earlier, ET is much higher than normal for this time of the year. But we're expecting a cool down here this next week, and so it'll give us a chance to really evaluate. I think guys are feeling like they're behind right now, but once we get another pass or two down, be able to see where we're at developmentally, and I think we've got some places we'll be able to start turning wells off.
Yeah. But your overall point here is that producers can be more strategic about terminating their irrigation for the season, and there are multiple reasons from a water conservation standpoint, economic standpoint, to do just that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, also, the compaction deal. What are we, in harvest time, having too much water out there? And, that's kind of the third and maybe final piece of this, Eric, is looking at, some work where a large number of producer fields were evaluated in western Kansas for several years, and this all would have been irrigated corn-on-corn production. In some of those fields, this would have been measured after harvest, and actually a significant number of fields where there was so much water still remaining in the profile that there was free drainage happening out the bottom. And so that's obviously not a good situation. We want to keep that water in the system where we can use it. And so and a big part of that, and this is where I really think, the probe technology can serve us very well is helping answer this question of when to turn them off, helping us gauge what's out there in the field.
So if you aren't utilizing that technology, look into it. If you are, make full use of it in the coming weeks. And, of course, we do have this article in the most recent Agronomy E-Update newsletter, and it does have all of the information, including the research charts that have been put together on this termination date for the various crops. That's at agronomy.ksu.edu, agronomy.ksu.edu. In addition, there is a special publication from K-State Research and Extension in the Irrigation Management Series on predicting the final irrigation for corn, grain sorghum, and soybeans. It has an actual form you can fill out following several steps on the stages of crop development, predicting the water use of that crop to maturity, and then determining the remaining usable water in the root zone. Plug in the numbers there, and it'll provide a calculation that'll give you further guidance on when to call it good with irrigation for the season. That can be found in the K-State Research and Extension online bookstore at bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu. And simply search for Final Irrigation. As always, Lucas, a pleasure. Thanks for talking this over with us right here.
You bet, Eric.
He's Lucas Haig, and Lucas is the Northwest Kansas Area Crop Production Specialist for K-State Research and Extension. We'll be back with more on agriculture today, including today's agricultural news headlines, this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop, and Mary Knapp on Kansas agricultural weather. All of that is still ahead on the K-State Radio Network.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and next up, today's agricultural news headlines. courtesy in part of DTN. USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue made a trip to Iowa yesterday, and while there, declared 18 counties in that state as disaster areas for agriculture, allowing producers hit by the derecho in those counties to access USDA programs for conservation and for cleanup. The Secretary said there are still some considerations for adding more counties depending on assessed losses. Here's more from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
The damage from that August 10th windstorm across Iowa is so great, so devastating, that Agriculture Secretary Sonny Perdue has declared 18 Iowa counties as primary federal disaster areas, making farmers there eligible for a cadre of disaster programs, including emergency loans. Perdue said he would be standing by to expand the disaster designations as more is learned about the full impacts of the derecho. Meanwhile, this week, expert USDA crop evaluators have been in Iowa doing
some additional survey work to get a better handle on the impacts of the derecho.
USDA's Outlook Board Chairman Mark Czekanowski says the derecho happened just a few hours before USDA released its August crop production report, so it didn't factor in the derecho at all. But the upcoming September report will provide a much better picture of
how that derecho might have affected both yield and potential harvested acres in Iowa.
The USDA report is due out September 11th, noon Eastern Time. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Now, that disaster designation in Iowa, however, does not include allowing producers in those areas to use the USDA's Wildfire and Hurricane Indemnity Program Plus, or WIP Plus, to cover their financial losses. The Secretary reiterated it would require legislation to open up Iowa to WIP Plus funds. Perdue said that is under the direction of Congress. He also said that obviously Louisiana is in a similar situation to Iowa. Perdue noted crop insurance remains the biggest safety net for Iowa farmers. He also raised some concerns about how insurance companies are determining losses under the derecho. Crop insurance companies in some cases are declaring a crop a total loss, while others are requiring producers to combine the crop this fall to determine yield losses. Producers raised that point with the Secretary when they spoke to him yesterday. And talking to reporters, Perdue also reiterated that the USDA will soon provide the rules for a second round of farmer aid under the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program, which has paid out to date about $9.4 billion to farmers for commodity losses documented before April the 15th. The USDA will come out with details next week for the next round. The number of commodities under CFAP 2 will expand to as many as 89 different crops and livestock, though it will not include any aid for ethanol, according to the Secretary. He said there was not enough money in the Commodity Credit Corporation to pay processors such as ethanol producers for their losses. And U.S. Chief Agriculture Trade Negotiator Greg Dowd briefed state officials on the latest trade policy developments at the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture meeting this week. The topics included a new enforcement mechanism for Canadian dairy commitments relative to the USMCA, China's progress toward meeting its commitments under the Phase 1 trade deal, and work toward a new free trade agreement with the UK. On China, Dowd reported great progress in terms of the procedural aspects of the Phase 1 agreement and China's compliance with procedural requirements. He said that there's an increase in the pace of China's U.S. agricultural commodity purchases, especially relative to corn and soybeans. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Planting winter wheat for both grazing and grain production is, of course, a common practice. With many growers here in the central and southern plains, some wheat varieties are better suited for this dual-purpose production than others, and those have been identified in a new K-State variety evaluation. Marcia Boswell has the details on this week's Kansas Wheat Scoop. Marcia?
Kansas State University researchers have released findings of a study to identify the best performing varieties when producers are growing wheat for grain and grazing, known as a dual-purpose system. K-State Research and Extension wheat specialist Romulo Lolato said he and his colleagues tested 28 wheat varieties at the South Central Experiment Field near Hutchinson, simulating grazing the crop in the winter and early spring and harvesting grain in the summer, to determine how the performance of different wheat varieties compared when managed under the dual-purpose system versus a grain-only system. Their results are now available in publication number MF3312, available from the K-State Research and Extension bookstore. Lolato said the three most important things we need to keep in mind when selecting a wheat variety for a dual-purpose system are fall forage production, the date of the first hollow stem, and how varieties respond to grazing stress. The yield potential of fall forage is important because it affects the potential beef production from cattle grazing wheat in the fall, winter, and spring. Lolato said approximately 100 pounds of beef can be produced for every 1,000 pounds of dry matter wheat forage production in an acre. The date of the first hollow stem will determine when producers should stop grazing cattle. Grazing past the first hollow stem can decrease the following spring's wheat yield by as much as 1 to 5% per day, he said. How well wheat varieties respond to stress often shows up in its grain yield following grazing as compared to the ungrazed counterparts. He said the recovery of wheat varieties from grazing is very specific to the variety. He said that one trend researchers found in their study is that wheat yields in a grain-only system might not necessarily indicate how a variety would stack up in a dual-purpose system. Lolato said what we saw this year is typically what we see year in and year out. Sometimes in the dual-purpose situation, we have different varieties showing up toward the top of the wheat yield rankings. The potential to bounce back from grazing is showing up whenever we look at the ranking of those varieties in the dual-purpose situation. For example, Lolato said a few varieties were among the top yielding group in both grazed and ungrazed scenarios. He said when evaluating the grazed plus grain group only, other varieties, including a few from Oklahoma State University, also appeared in the top yielding group, showing that those varieties might be better suited for the dual-purpose system. The new publication outlines those varieties that are expected to be the best candidates for a dual-purpose system, based on being exposed to grazing stress during the early stages of development. Lolato has also posted the publication and other updates regarding Kansas wheat production on Twitter. Search for @KSUWheat. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia, and we'll be back in a moment here on Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
Next up for you on Agriculture Today, our weekly venture into the Kansas agricultural weather scene. Along with us once more is climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension, with fresh in hand the summary on our conditions in Kansas for the month of August, Mary. And folks may have come to the conclusion already that it was a dry month as Augusts go. Was that borne out in the numbers?
Yes, it was, actually. Statewide, none of the divisions were above average. The wettest, believe it or not, was the West Central, where they were 89% of normal, and that was the wettest spot across the state. Comes in as the 12th driest August on record, which puts you in a pretty dry month. And that's kind of a switch since July was the 8th wettest that we had seen. So, again, dryness across the state. There were pockets that were wetter than normal. For example, Leota had over 4 inches of rain, which is not usual for their area, but you didn't have to go very far to get places that had less than an inch. So, again, by and large, a very dry month.
And that funnels into the latest drought update, which we'll talk of. Was it a cooler than normal month? It seemed so, Mary.
Again, it was split depending upon where you were at. In the south central and most of the eastern two-thirds of the state, it was cooler than normal. But again, when you get up into that northwest corner, the west central, it tended to be on the warmer side. The Northwest Division was about 2 degrees warmer than normal on average. The South Central was about 2 degrees cooler than normal on average. Statewide, the departure was about 0.5 degree, which is so close to normal it's kind of hard to even talk about it. We did have 100-plus temperatures in most of the divisions. The exception was northeast and east central, but even southeast Kansas hit the century mark. The hottest temperature recorded was 105 out at Atwood in northwest Kansas. So again, we did see those 100-degree readings, but not on the record scale for the most part. I think there were 6 daily record highs and 14 daily record minimum high temperatures. So we were more on the cool side than we were on the record-setting heat.
So that's the recap on August. We're into September now, and given that we've had precious little moisture the past several days, one would assume that the drought in Kansas has intensified.
It has to a certain degree. We've had some expansion of abnormally dry conditions across north central Kansas and a little bit of severe drought creeping southward out of Nebraska in northwest Kansas. Noteworthy, we did have some extreme drought creep across the border, if you will, from Colorado into the western reaches of Wallace, Greeley, and Hamilton counties. There was some improvement in the drought in southeast Kansas, where they did see a little bit more, again, some isolated spots in Bourbon County and Cherokee County, where they had enough to make some improvements in that area. But again, remember, July was one of the wettest on record, so there's a lot of subsoil moisture in there. Unfortunately, that rapid shift from very, very wet to very, very dry has created some problems, particularly in the soybean crop. The root development wasn't particularly robust. If you had light soils, sandy soils, things that looked great 2 weeks ago are looking very, very dire now. And Ignacio Ciampiti noted in his crop condition update yesterday that you could lose as much as 40% of the yield due to the fact that we're right in the highest water demand for the crop right now.
Oh, that's quite a hit. So having a rain roll in here soon and a widespread event at that, critical to our soybean producers, is that in the offing?
Well, there is a chance towards the end of the week period. Yesterday, when we checked out the quantitative precip forecast for the 7-day outlook, there was a widespread area of 1 inch plus of rain across most of the state, but it was towards the end of that 7-day period. So we're looking at probably somewhere close to the Wednesday time frame. The latest weather forecasts call for an increased chance of rain Tuesday night into Wednesday, maybe into Thursday. It's really important that that actually materializes, because if we extend the outlook to the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14, which carries us out to the middle and towards that third week of September, both of those outlooks are calling for an increased chance of below normal precipitation.
As far as the temperature outlook is concerned, another cool down to accompany that hoped for moisture?
Yes, actually, we're going to have a fairly warm start to the weekend, and then the first of the cold fronts is expected to come through. That will be more of a wind shift and a temperature drop, maybe a drop in the humidities, but not much chance for rain coming with it. The second round is going to be a little bit more vigorous, and that's when we have that chance of rain, but we're going to have a significant drop in temperatures. When we look at midweek towards the end of next week, we may see highs only in the 70s and lows in the 40s. We're going to be fortunate in Kansas. It doesn't look like the freezing temperatures are going to be creeping into our world, but they are talking about freezing temperatures up in the Dakotas, into Wyoming and Colorado, and they're actually talking about a chance for snow all the way down the Rockies into New Mexico.
So this is leading here in Kansas to a September outlook for a cool next several weeks.
Right, and the overall outlook for September is cooler than normal, and it's going to be front-weighted by that very cold start to the month that we're expecting. On the other side, that moisture that we may get to start out September isn't likely to extend itself, and the overall outlook for September is for drier than normal statewide.
Well, it keeps coming back to the importance of that rainfall materializing next week. Let's look for that and hopefully talk about it next Friday. Mary, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Eric.
Climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension. And to let you know, we'll be away on Monday for the Labor Day holiday, so we'd invite you to rejoin us right here on Tuesday. Until then, Eric Atkinson bidding you a good holiday weekend for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.